Greetings all, FerrariMan601 here. Welcome back to another pontificating video, this time about IndyCar, and specifically about IndyCar and Pocono Raceway. This past weekend, we of course had the ABC Supply Company 500, which of course I had the distinct pleasure of attending for the third year running. Started to come here in 2017, and I've been going back ever since. So for my third time coming to this event, again, I have got to say off the top here, Pocono always do a brilliant job putting on a show like this. Everything is incredibly well organized and incredibly well maintained. The circuit, everything from the landscaping to the logistical management of parking and traffic flow, everything is always done incredibly well. Concessions are available and not ridiculously high priced. You get good seating options in the infield grandstands as well as in the main grandstands along start finish. Really, it's a great time. IndyCar do a great job sanctioning this and running this whole event. I had paddock passes again, so I was able to walk through the paddock and pit lane only about an hour before the start. You get to see the cars up close and personal. It got some great fire-ups and shift checks. It's just really cool to be standing next to a live, active race car that you know in about an hour is going to be flying around the circuit doing 200-plus miles an hour. It's a really cool thing, and I really love that IndyCar have maintained this level of accessibility to the fans. It's absolutely great. It's a fantastic thing for building the presence of a sport. It's a great thing for getting people interested and for keeping people interested. And with IndyCar having aspirations for expansion heading into 2020 and 2021, that is only going to be a good thing. So the trajectory in general for IndyCar, I believe, is going to be on an upswing for the foreseeable future, and it's very good to see and very welcome to see in the rather stratified world of open-wheel racing. What has become a little bit of a white elephant, a little bit of a thorn in our side, a little bit of an elephant in the room is Pocono Raceway itself and IndyCar's presence at Pocono Raceway. Is IndyCar appropriate for Pocono, and is Pocono appropriate for IndyCar? IndyCar revived the Pocono event starting in 2013 after a multi-decade absence from Long Pond, Pennsylvania. And I've got to say they have done a fantastic job reviving this event. The attendance figures have been going up steadily year after year. I first started coming here in 2017, and now in 2019, the crowd size was notably larger on the Sunday. The Saturday was a little bit broken up because the first practice session and the qualifying session had to be scuttled because of rain, but we had a compromise at the end with a 2-hour free practice in the afternoon, which was fantastic to watch in and of itself. And I think IndyCar needs to investigate the possibility of doing more things like that as part of a normal schedule, because you got to see all the cars out on track, you got some pack running, you had live action pit stops going on. It was really cool. The teams were doing race simulations the whole way. Really marvelous, and it was very much like watching the race itself. It was that sort of action. Fantastic. However, this year at Pocono, 2019, we have now had the second major incident at the start of the race at Turn 2. Of course, those of you who have been watching IndyCar will know all about the 2018 ABC Supply Co. 500 at Pocono, in which we had that incident involving Robert Wickens. And unfortunately, Robert still is recovering from the injuries that he sustained in that absolutely terrifying and violent impact. Thankfully, though, Robert Wickens is still with us, and thankfully he is even able to opine now, in particular with the regard of Pocono and IndyCar. Is it a happy marriage? According to what Mr. Wickens said on Twitter on the 18th of August during the race, he says that the marriage between Pocono and IndyCar is not at all happy, and that IndyCar racing should not happen at Pocono. It's too dangerous, he says. Now, we can argue as to whether or not it's the fault of drivers in terms of causing incidents. I think there's an argument to be made for both the Wickens accident as well as the accident that we had here in 2019 being caused by drivers, be it driver error or driver miscalculations. That is a completely separate argument. I think we could all agree that the incident in 2018 was initiated by contact between cars, and the incident in 2019 was initiated by contact between cars. Takuma Sato coming down on Alexander Rossi in the approach to turn 2. However, regardless of what causes an incident, what then happens next is what is in question here. And this is a problem that's just inherent to oval circuits, really, because these facilities, despite them being absolutely enormous, and if you've never been to a place like Pocono or Indianapolis, you really will be hard-pressed to comprehend just how huge these places are. If you wanted to walk from turn 3 to turn 1 at Pocono at a normal pace, it would take you a better part of a half hour, 45 minutes to do it if you're just taking your time. They're absolutely huge. The front straight at Pocono is 90 feet wide, and if you wanted to park, say, the Titanic on the front straight at Pocono, it would fit between the barriers, and then you would still have 2/3 of the straight remaining distance-wise. So it's a huge facility. However, that real estate really starts to become a premium when you have cars going 3, 4, 5, and sometimes even 6 wide down that 90-foot wide start straightaway at 200-something miles an hour. In particular, turn 2 at Pocono is of particular concern because it's the narrowest point on the circuit, and all 3 corners at Pocono in this triangular configuration are different from each other, and that was done quite intentionally by the track's architects. Turn 2 is basically a copy of all 4 corners at Indianapolis. It's got a very shallow camber, very shallow banking, and it's a relatively short corner as well. It's much shorter than turns 1 or turn 3. Therefore, it's a place where the cars are put under the most pressure aerodynamically over the course of a lap. Usually turn 2, when a car is running in qualifying trim, can be taken absolutely flat out. But it's always a compromise because you've got to get through 2 other corners, which are fundamentally different from turn 2 as well as from each other in terms of 1 and 3. And you've got yourself trimmed out aerodynamically because you want the maximum straight line speed that you can get as you're going down the straights, which comprise the vast majority of the lap at a place like this. So if you do get a sudden unexpected burst of crosswind, or if you do get a little bit of contact between cars, either on the approach or going through turn 2, the car is on a knife edge to begin with, which means it's going around, and the first thing you hit is going to be the barrier, and then once you hit the barrier, more often than not, we've seen these cars start to get bounced airborne and into the catch fence around turn 2 here at Pocono. So then, at this point, I would believe, because we have had 2 years in succession where we have had 2 major incidents at turn 2 at Pocono, I think it now begs IndyCar and its technical body to do some soul searching in terms of, do they continue to race at Pocono? Do they continue to allow drivers to conduct themselves in the manners in which we're accustomed to them conducting themselves in terms of their on-track behavior, particularly on the first lap? Or is there a compromise to be made someplace? And I think the answer, of course, is always going to be compromise to some degree. Compromise in the sense of perhaps we get a little bit more stringent in terms of driver behavior. If you get contact between cars in a way that should have been avoidable. In the case of Takuma Sato coming down into Alexander Rossi, his spotter well knew that Sato was not clear to the inside, and Sato just bolts down to the inside and basically rams headlong into the side of Rossi, which starts this whole chain reaction incident. So that's one hand of the argument. The other hand of this, though, is Pocono itself. I believe that IndyCar and Pocono is something that is good. It brings a race to the Northeast. It brings a race that's reasonably accessible to most people in the Northeast. Obviously, New York City being the most populated area in the Northeast and the most populated area per capita in the United States. So if IndyCar wants to be truly the premier racing series in America, never mind the world at this point, you need a race in the Northeast. And Pocono, I think, is the perfect venue for it. It's not terribly far away from New York. Where I'm coming from in New Jersey, it's about a 2-hour drive. It's totally accessible if you want to do it for a day trip, and it's totally accessible if you're like me and you want to do it for an overnight trip, and you get there on the Saturday and you go home after the race on Sunday. It's great. It's conveniently located. You get lots of hotels, good places to stay, good places to eat, and generally a good crowd at the circuit. However, that does not necessarily mean that we have to have IndyCar race at Pocono on the oval. There are a couple other configurations that are available at Pocono, but they're all completely inadequate at this point for what IndyCar is nowadays. First of all, you have the North Circuit and you have the South Circuit. These are basically only good for road cars and maybe Formula 2000 cars. I've driven a Formula 2000 car at Pocono on the North Circuit. I had a great time. I felt that the circuit was adequate for that, doing at most 130 miles an hour coming down what was into turn one for us in that configuration. Would I want to be in anything larger or anything more powerful going through that? I don't know, to be honest. Certainly, an 800 horsepower Indy car is not going to be adequate for the North Circuit, the South Circuit, or even the International Circuit, which is also available at this place. That was last used by IMSA all the way back in the mid-1980s. So there you go in terms of all of that. It's possible, perhaps, and perhaps this is something that needs to be investigated. Do we need to renovate the infield circuits at Pocono? Do we need to renovate those slip roads and those other circuit configurations to make them more accessible to IndyCar with the high downforce and high horsepower and the big sticky slick tires if we do want to maintain this race? Perhaps. Do we need to construct a new chicane on the international layout to bypass turn 2 entirely? Let's even say if we want to race in the opposite direction to the oval, make turn 2 a right-hander instead of a left-hander, I think that would be warranted in terms of investigation. But what I don't want to have happen, and I've seen this happen already on social media, I don't want to have the talking point be IndyCar and Pocono need to go away. With as much respect as I have for Mr. Wickens, and obviously if there's anybody out here who really does have the expertise and the experience to talk about this issue, it is Robert Wickens. I don't think it would be a good idea to get rid of the race entirely, but something absolutely needs to be done about turn 2, the barriers, and the catch fencing, because, again, you can't have 2 races in succession over 2 years having a similar sort of incident at the same corner and having the same result for the most part. Thankfully, Felix Rosenqvist, he was able to more or less walk away under his own power, and he was released after preliminary checks even during the race, and it was confirmed that he was fine. But something needs to be done about this, and for me, I don't want to see more incidents at Pocono. I don't go to these races to watch crashes. I certainly don't go to these races to watch drivers get injured or worse. So I think we need to have a little bit of a discussion about Pocono, its place on the calendar, and the actual configuration of the circuit. I mean, if we learned anything in 2018, it's that motor racing is dangerous. And, of course, it's going to remain dangerous because you don't have cars doing a couple 100 miles an hour with no risk factor at all. That would be silly. But there are certain risks which can be mitigated, and we've seen risks being mitigated in the past, and thankfully they have been. Fire, very, very heavily mitigated now in terms of the equipment that the drivers use and they wear, the safety equipment that's at the circuits, the people who are trained to deploy that safety equipment, the construction of the cars themselves, very much mitigating the risks of fire. The equipment that the drivers wear in terms of the Hans device, getting rid of the basilar skull fractures that unfortunately took many drivers from us and nearly took even more drivers from us. That problem has been essentially demolished, destroyed, completely deleted from the world thanks to the Hans device. And I think in terms of catch fencing and the safer barriers, even though they do a great job at absorbing energy, there needs to be a little bit more work in terms of making them a little bit more open-wheeler friendly, because when sticky tires get onto those safer barriers, they tend to ride up and pull the cars upward toward the catch fence. So we need a little bit of a call to action here in terms of innovation. We need to get these cars and these barriers to be a little bit more cohesive, to be a little bit more harmonious in terms of working with each other, making sure that cars stay on the ground rather than riding up barriers and getting into fencing, because that's what causes injuries, and that is what causes us to have a bad day. So that is what I would like everybody to come away with this from. Basically, that's all I've got to say here. Just some random thoughts and some suggestions, some ideas in terms of what could be done. If you have any ideas in terms of whether IndyCar should remain at Pocono, whether Pocono and IndyCar are appropriate for each other, whether any changes could be made to the current circuit in terms of changing turn 2 or changing the barriers, or perhaps could there be another configuration altogether that we could use at Pocono, or is there another track that perhaps could host an East Coast IndyCar race should it come down to it? Let me know in the comments. What do you think, and what were your reactions to these incidents in 2018 with Robert Wickens and now 2019 with Rossi, Sato, and Rosenqvist? And, of course, let's not forget about Justin Wilson. Completely different set of circumstances entirely, but, again, it was Pocono as well. That was host for that fateful day. But let me know what you think about all of this. Until next time, though, I do thank you all very much for watching. Ferrari Man 601 saying thanks, and, of course, we will see you soon.